be describing his life experiences, including life at Asbury, a sense of how Asbury has fit into Washington, D.C. history, and connections with Washington, including his varied work background, his service, and various things that he has done. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview, your willingness to do it. Quite sure that it will contribute to the archives of Asbury as well as the archives of the DC Oral History Collaborative. You will be able to listen to this recording in the future, and you have the right to refuse to answer any question that we come across today. And just want you to have fun with your memories. We look forward to hearing some of them.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So, you have the proud honor of being a native Washingtonian. Can we just talk, starting with Asbury or schools, because you were a product of the DC public school system?
Correct. So, yeah, I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Been a D.C. resident all my life, well until going into the military. But, yeah, in the early days, born and raised, came home from George Washington University Hospital to 502 L Street Northeast. I lived in that same house my entire life until I graduated Howard University and went into the military. And in those days, it was a little bit unusual to be born and raised and grow up in the same house and not move around. But very fond memories of DC and Asbury United Methodist Church. As a matter of fact, after growing up and having multiple experiences since 26 years in the military and subsequent to that, there are two things that feel extremely familiar to me, very just right. One is my family, because they've been constant, and two is Asbury. I know people at Asbury I've known my entire life. They've known me my entire life. And so Asbury is family, and that certainly is a large part of my growing up.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Your
Sure.
parents obviously were members of Asbury when you were born. You were christened at Asbury.
Correct.
And your parents were active in the church? I know your father died when you were a young age, at the age of 11. But did he get you started in the service to Asbury?
They were both very active in the church. As a matter of fact, my dad, God rest his soul, he was what was called a class leader, which means we call it stewardship, or in essence, what was responsible for basically bringing Asbury to people in the community and helping other folks in our community, in our neighborhood, know about Asbury. Back in those days, so yeah, he would walk through the neighborhood and he would knock on doors and he would introduce himself and he would represent Asbury and he would invite them to Asbury. He wasn't always an Asbury member. He belonged to to another church, but after he and my mom got married back in the late 40s, 1940, 1949, he changed his membership and became a member of Asbury, and he was a very active member. My mom always was a very active member until the day she died.
When he was walking through the neighborhood, did he ever take you or any of your siblings with him?
Normally he would do that by himself. On rare occasions he did, because I do remember going with him at least once. It wasn't something that he would normally do, but normally he was a pretty focused, a pretty disciplined, I'd even say serious person. So
how did you feel when you were with him? Were you proud? Were you thinking, this is something I too might do one day?
I think I was more in sort of a mentee role, where I was more watching and observing than anything. To be perfectly honest, did I ever think about that I would do that someday? Never sort of crossed my mind. To be perfectly honest, I probably was thinking, and I could be out playing kickball or something right now.
So talk about some of the things that you did do in service to Asbury as a child and on up through your adult years.
Yeah, sure. As mentioned, I was born and raised in Asbury. And that was in the days where we had a burgeoning youth population. All of my contemporaries. That's one of the reasons we had to build the education building. It was built back in 1973. But growing up in Asbury was in the Boy Scouts. In the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, Troop 542, and then also was an acolyte. We called it altar boys back in those days. And I was an altar boy until I was taller than the Reverend. As a matter of fact, it was Reverend Campaign. I said to him, he was an associate minister and he was responsible for the acolytes. He and Alice Carr, and I said to him one day, and it must have been about 16 or 17, I said to him, Reverend Campaign, I think I'm getting a little big for this. And he didn't have a comeback. He said, I think so too. So, but my brothers and I, we would routinely go down there. We would alter sometimes both 8:30 and 11 o'clock service, and doing Easter, where they had 7 last words, where it was a 3-hour service on Friday, Good Friday.
What are the 7 last words?
This was where you would have you'd have a number of ministers come in, and for about 3 hours, they would just take turns taking the pulpit and giving the 7 last words, and so service would last for 3 hours, and you would rotate altar boys, because in those days they were altar boys, girls weren't on the altar. They changed that to acolytes and introduced girls at some point, but and it was not uncommon that it would be myself and my 2 brothers and maybe 1 or 2 acolytes or altar boys in those days that would be down there for the entire 3 hours.
So talk about some of the pastors that you remember that influenced you. Since you were christened there, you've seen a number of pastors come and go.
Sure.
Who stands out in your mind, or are there stories that you can share?
Oh, without a doubt, James D. Foy. He's the one that I remember the most. He was there for the first probably 16 years of my life, and his wife also was a counselor at McKinley Tech, a guidance counselor. But when I went through, when we had leadership training, it was Reverend James D. Foy who actually administered that training when you're 12 years old and you go through your Christian leadership training. And so he definitely was a standout, primarily because he was the first minister I ever really knew, and then he retired, and that's when Frank Leviticus Williams showed up, and he was another one that really made an impression on us. Then we, by that time I graduated college, gone into the Air Force, and I'd come back. Josh Hutchins was there, and then subsequent to him, Eugene Matthews, who I did a lot of work with. As a matter of fact, he asked me to cheer on Eagles' Wings, which was a celebration to bring people back to church, but then also it was a stewardship drive to raise money. And then subsequent to him, of course, Louis Shockley, and now Dr. Mills.
Before we talk, more about your professional life, can we talk about some of the choices that you made professionally, but that how you used some of that in the church? You talked about leadership.
Sure.
You took leadership training, and then you ended up going in the military. So how have you woven these disciplines that you've engaged in through your personal life and through the professional?
So as you can imagine, from ROTC through the military, you not only were involved in leadership training, but leadership opportunities. And I routinely would, and it's not uncommon that you would very quickly accept leadership responsibility. And I did likewise. So to answer your question, I transferred that to Asbury. And very early on, when I came back to this area, in a military capacity, still active duty, but I served on various committees in leadership roles, Child Development Center, where I was one of the officers, actually a secretary on that board. But then twice I was a member of the Board of Trustees. With a background in architecture and civil engineering, that was just an incredible fit. There were a number of projects that were going on. One, quite frankly, when I was in school, it was the building of the education building. As a matter of fact, my professor, Leroy J.H. Brown, was the architect of record for that structure, and so he and I worked quite a bit together. For me, it was more really seeing the things that we were learning in school actually transpiring there as the construction was going, and he pointing these things out to me as I was matriculating through the School of Architecture. But back to some of the things that I've done since I've, in my professional, since I've graduated. In addition, I've been on the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, in a leadership role, and most recently as the chair of the Finance Committee.
So let's talk about some of the choices that you made then about going to school and what you wanted to do, and how some of the discipline that you talked about with your dad. You said your dad was a serious person, a disciplined person. How did that come on to you, and how have you used that in your Asbury life and in your life as a father, as a husband, and as an African American man?
Sure. So my dad was a very disciplined person. My mother as well. And I hate to say is, my dad, as I mentioned, passed when I was only 11 years old. Probably the most influential person in my life, quite frankly, was my mother, because when I was 11, she had to be both mother and father. We didn't miss a beat as a result, and because she was also so incredibly disciplined, but also both of them were very, they were very disciplined about church and Christianity and doing the right thing. And so that did have an impact on me. I think that's why the military so resonated with me, because of the values that I learned at home I found in the military. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in everything that you do. Those are Air Force values, but I realized those were my personal values that I learned from home, from my mother and my father. So it resonated. So some of the very same things that I had to do in the military, discipline, appreciating, recognizing, giving respect to authority, those were all values that I learned at home.
And was that part of why you chose the military?
Certainly the military was attractive to me, but when I got in the military, I realized it wasn't something I had to really get used to. It was really, it was the way I was designed. So.
Now, you grew up in turbulent times.
I did.
Let's talk about some of that. What do you remember, starting earliest and then
Sure.
continuing forward?
Here's what I remember very vividly. I was in the 8th grade. It was 1968, and spring of '68, and as fate would have it, Martin Luther King was killed. We were released early from school, but because I did grow up in a disciplined household where it was very important that work ethic was something I learned from both my parents, my mom and dad. I had a part-time job, and it was way up 16th Street. It was a Webster all-girl college, a women's college, and got on the bus to go to my part-time job that evening. And this story is about work ethic. Riots were happening all over U Street. I was on a bus that the bus driver had us to get off the bus at 16th and U. But I knew I had to go to work. So I walked all the way up to 16th and Calamar. Got to work. Really, no one expected that I would be there. And we actually, it was myself and another guy that worked up there, we wound up having to stay up there that evening because that evening when we left work, we got on 16th Street and we actually we were shot at.
Oh my.
Yeah. So we actually had to run down the alley back to Webster College. They put us up for the night.
How old were you again?
I was, I just turned 14. I turned 14 in March. This was in April. And called mom, told her I was okay, and so came home the next day. Likewise, we get on 16th Street. We couldn't even catch a cab. No one would pick myself and this other guy I was with, a couple years older than I was, but also African American. So we walked all the way home to 5th and L Street Northeast. But here's what I remember as we walked past Mount Vernon Square, right there not far from Asbury. Remember how pungent the smell of tear gas was from the day before. And when I got home, and all of the neighborhood stores, all the stores on 8th Street, the haberdashers and department stores had been rioted, had been looted. And during the riots, they had been looted. And it was just an incredible, it was just a very turbulent time in America.
How did you feel as a 14-year-old seeing your neighborhood and this change? How did you feel?
Times were changing. It was pretty radical. I got to tell you, probably without a doubt, the most. I think when I realized anything could happen to anybody, anytime, was when my dad died, some 3 years previous. So it sort of numbed me to really what could happen. So really, what I was really thinking is, what does the future really portend for blacks, for people in general, when you take a peacemaker like Martin Luther King and someone would so violently gun him down. So I think it was a rude awakening for everybody, and certainly a 14-year-old, but for anybody. So.
And what was Asbury's role in that for you? Was it a place of solace, not just for you, but perhaps for the city, the congregation, anything at all that you recall?
So Asbury was always a place of solace. The one place that you could always, when I was at Asbury, there was a calm, there was a peace, there was always abundance of love and outreach. Speaking of Martin Luther King and Asbury, turn the clock back about 5 years to 1963 and the March on Washington and Martin Luther King speaking at the Lincoln Memorial. I remember Asbury played a very significant part in that as well. Asbury's always opened its doors to social movements. as written right on the placard right outside of our building. It was a part of the underground where Harriet Tubman actually shuttled people through some 100 years previous. So yeah, Asbury was always, Asbury's always been like home. As I mentioned, it's always a place you could go and find solace and people that you've always known.
You talked about being an architect, and the desire to do that started early on. We're going to take a pause, and then we're going to come back and pick that up.
Okay.
So we were talking about architecture.
Sure.
Let's talk about how you made the decision to go to McKinley Tech. You were in the Dunbar zone.
I was. I went to Terrell Junior High School, and Terrell, although it was an incredible experience, 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade, wonderful time in my life. Wouldn't want to go back there, but it was a wonderful time in my life. But I realized there was, I wanted something more different. I was always interested in architecture, and I found out that McKinley High School, unlike Dunbar, had certain programs. Something like a pre-med, pre-engineering, pre-architecture, pre-art, and music. And so I went there because of their pre-architecture program.
How does a young black boy get interested in architecture?
I'd taken mechanical drawing in 7th grade, and there was something about the sense of mechanical drawing that just completely resonated with me. It was the perfect combination between math and art, because there's a lot of geometry in mechanical drawing, and it was very neat. It was very neat. It was very clean. It was very precise. And I've always been interested in buildings and construction. And so architecture just seemed to be the right thing. So when I found out about McKinley having a program in architectural drawing, I was very intrigued. I applied, I was accepted, I went there in that program outside of my zone. Because as mentioned, I should have gone to Dunbar, but I wound up going to McKinley specifically for this, and it was probably one of the, it worked.
But in those days, was it easy to accomplish that waiver, if you will?
I don't know how, I don't know how easy or hard it was. I don't know if they had a number of people clamoring to get into that program. I really don't know what the competition was. I just have no clue. I know I applied and it worked.
Nobody got in trouble.
No, it was all sanctioned. But I went there and I realized that the whole process of architecture was exactly what I really enjoyed. I would routinely wear a tie
to school.
Just to school, because you sort of get into the zone of being an architect.
Black instructors?
Yes. Oliver Stover was my architecture, mechanical drawing, then architectural drafting instructor. And he was very pedantic. He was very hard to please. He was someone that you had to get it precise, or he would draw circles around the corners if they were just a millimeter off. So he was very precise. So if you could do well, and I remember I had this very intricate mechanical drawing project that I had to do, And I spent a lot of time on it, and I just wasn't sure how it was. Quite frankly, I didn't think the guy could be pleased at all. I got an A.
Wow.
And that was motivation enough for me to, it gave me the confidence to know that I could, this was something that I was, that was in my wheelhouse. And did that for 3 years, applied to many schools of architecture up and down the East Coast. And I decided, once I got the acceptance from Howard, why leave town? And so I went there in the 5-year architecture program, and it was probably, without a doubt, I think one of the best programs around.
You were going to, this is a question, it's not a statement.
Sure.
Were you going to have to work your way through school? Was finance an issue in any of your decision making?
Finance was always an issue, but my mother told me, she said, Cardell, she said, don't worry about it. You're going to college. And so I went to college. I also was in Rotc, where you got $100 stipend a month in the final 2 years. But with loans and with Mom making sure that I didn't have to, she made sure tuition was always paid. It was something I didn't worry about. I did work part-time on occasions, but there were occasions where I'd have to tell Mom, you know, I'm not going to be able to work part-time. She said, never worry about that. And I didn't. And I could just concentrate on studies.
And at that point, you already had siblings that were in the Air Force?
I did. I had 2 brothers that were in the Air Force, both enlisted at the time. My oldest brother retired while I was still in college. My older brother, Canardo, who is still a member at Asbury, he separated from the Air Force, but then he came to Howard, and he got into Rotc. He was my older brother, but he was a couple of years junior to me in school and in Rotc, which was interesting. But then when we both came on active duty, and you know, in 4 years you're a captain. At some point we were both captains together, and it was just, we were just peers.
How did you feel being a captain in the Air Force? This had been your goal. What was it like when you achieved it?
It's incredible because you get a tremendous amount of leadership responsibilities and opportunities, but you get a lot of opportunities to just to do your craft. I was a base architect down in Texas. Then I moved to another position where I was doing building energy audits, and you know, as a captain, Pindon captain in Korea, and I had a huge responsibility for all the environmental engineering. Subsequent to that, went to Andrews Air Force Base, where I actually ran a huge engineering division. So I learned, I was given a lot of responsibility, but given a lot of opportunities, and but you're given a lot of opportunity to develop confidence in what you can do.
Now, you had come through some different times also at Howard. When you were there, this was the time, if I recall, of Black Power, of riots, of Vietnam. You were focused, but how did it affect what you were doing and just your growth, do you believe, in any way?
Yeah, I think it affected everyone. This was this is when blacks were coming of a certain consciousness and realizing that you could do anything given opportunity, and in some cases not waiting for opportunities, but sort of forcing the point. So yeah, it was still turbulent times, but you had to work through it. You know, we were talking about, this was during the time also when, as I was coming through college, when Vietnam was at its height. But it also ended while I was in college. Rolling Thunder and Linebacker were those two major campaigns in '75 where everything was brought to a head. As people were exiting the military, as they were coming home from Vietnam, they were spat on in the airports and the like. And so it wasn't really it wasn't a very welcoming environment for anyone in uniform. I knew this, but I had two brothers that were serving. I had cousins and other relatives that had served. So that was less a deterrent than anything. And like anything in life, you wait long enough and the pendulum swings. I remember when I came on active duty, Vietnam became in '77, and Vietnam became very gradually a distant memory. And we were on to doing other things that made the military, quite frankly, I spent 26 years there, retired in 2003, and it was probably one of the highlights of my entire life.
You married also in 1977?
77 was a big year for me because I graduated college. My wife graduated. She was my girlfriend at the time. Graduated college. We'd been going together for about 8 years, all through high school and college. And
she was at Howard as well?
She was at Morgan. She was at Morgan. And so we graduated same time. We got married on the 2nd of July. 2 weeks later, I was on active duty. Honeymoon was driving down to my first duty station in San Antonio, Texas. So graduating, getting commissioned in the military, come on active duty, and get married. So yeah, and it all happened within a couple of months of one another.
Was she an Asburian as well?
She was. She became an Asburian sometime when we were in high school. We met in junior high school, and sometime when we were in high school, she became a member of Asbury. So she's been an Asburian for, well, not as long as I have, but almost as long.
So you've served together over the years?
We have. We've done a number of things at Asbury together. She currently, we work the food pantry together. That's her calling, her ministry. She's a clinical licensed social worker, and so she has a passion for people and for helping people. And she knew she wanted to serve doing the food pantry, and I help. And then routinely every year during Thanksgiving, we make sure that a needy family have turkeys, and we distribute them from Asbury. We pick them up and distribute them from Asbury.
So your family has been born around the world for the most part, or lived around the world? What has that been like for you?
Yeah, that's been incredible. I've lived in Korea. Whole family, we've lived in Europe. We lived in Germany, but traveled all over Europe. And what it's shown us is that people are, as much as we are different, we're more alike than we are different. And it really, there's a sort of a basic to all people, and that is, and we've had neighbors all over, we lived all over the country, out in the Midwest, the Southwest, the East Coast, and we've learned that it really is important to just be considerate, treat people the way you would expect to be treated, and regardless of how bad you hear people are basically good. And I think if you look for the good in people, you'll find it. We've had assignments where we've only been there for a couple of years at a time. In the military, you make fast friends. And so that means you have to be a friend. And so we've had acquaintances that we've had for decades.
Now, does that prepare you for what you see in Washington, D.C. today in terms of the gentrification that's taken place? I know we talked about your neighborhood, your original on L Street,
Mm-hmm.
and having been there for so many years. What's your impression when you walk through there nowadays?
Oh yeah, we've seen that. As a matter of fact, I routinely say if I hadn't grown up here and been here doing the transition, I routinely say if you dropped me out the sky and asked me where was I wouldn't have a clue. Because it's so different from growing up, where we had very low-rise buildings, where development was very slow, where we had, especially after the riots of '68, where we had vacant lots all over the place, just where business people would not invest, and kids growing up here had to make the best out of what they had. Also, when I think about some of the books we had in public school and the lack of really good black history, because it was written by people who didn't know black history. But I've seen an incredible change. A lot has changed. There's been a lot of development. You talk about gentrification. The demographic here in Washington, D.C. has changed immensely. I remember when purportedly there were over 90, it was like 90% black. I don't think that number is exactly what it was. I think it was something closer in the 70s, but I know now it's probably close to the 50s or less. But there's been a development explosion where I remember walking from 5th and L Street Northeast to 11th and K Street Northwest. And as I mentioned, low-rise buildings, a lot of my friends that went to Terrell Junior High School and went on to Dunbar, they lived there. All of those are gone. Commerce has happened. That's all high-rise condos. And high rent, I might add. We've seen the streets developed. For goodness sakes, the trolley car, which is just a novelty for a certain demographic that would have never been put there back when I was growing up, and it really was a chocolate city.
Can you contrast the youth experience that you had growing up to perhaps what your kids and what you're seeing for your grandkids right now?
Yes. When I was growing up, majority of, I would say the larger population of blacks were not going to college. Something happened, I would say probably just about the time my wife and I were graduating high school. There was a real push, a realization, I would say a consciousness that said if blacks were ever going to do anything, education was a must. And I saw more and more of my contemporaries going to college as I did. And previously, that was not the case.
They would go to the military?
They would go to, they would generally go in the military. They would go immediately into to work for Bell Atlantic or government or construction work. But most people didn't see themselves going to college, blue-collar workers. And then at some point, that changed. I think the riots had a lot to do with it. That is where people were no longer waiting for opportunities, but they were pushing the edge of the envelope. If you remember in '64, it was the Civil Rights Act was passed, and then in '65, the Voting Rights Act passed. And so I think a lot of that had to do with the progression a lot of Martin Luther King's March on Washington for Equality. And I think, I think people like myself, my wife, my siblings, I think we were benefactors of that struggle quite a bit. So to contrast that, many of us also went to historically black universities and colleges. As I said, I went to Howard University. My wife went to Morgan. Most of my friends that I graduated college with went to places like Cheney State and Morehouse and places that were historically black universities, Howard University, as I mentioned. Fast forward to my kids, and after seeing the world and seeing what's out there, and we ironically wound up back here in Centerville, Virginia. Both of my kids graduated from Centerville High School, and both went to schools and went to school on scholarship. My son had athletic scholarship to Wake Forest. Very wonderful small school, extremely well endowed. It's not a historically black university. My daughter could have gone virtually anywhere. She went on an academic scholarship, but she wound up going out to Iowa State, predominantly white. Matter of fact, I think the African American population was 3%. And she went out there. It's a big school, it's like 20,000. She went out there on a scholarship for chemical engineering. The point is, it proved that blacks can compete on any level, anywhere, with anyone. And I don't think we always knew that when I was coming up. But thank God for historically black schools, because they always knew that, and it was certainly an opportunity to do well and to progress.
What do you remember about Asbury contributing to that sense of self and the ability to do well?
Well, you know, Asbury always had a membership of people who had certain affluence. I remember Isham Baker, registered architect. He was an FAIA, which is a Fellows of the American Institute of Architects. He was a quintessential architect. And what he said and what he did said that you can do anything. Just do your craft, do it well, and compete well. And then there were others. I think you also talked to Dr. Clive Callender, who is a world-renowned, heart specialist. And it goes on. But the point is these individuals were exemplars of what you could do, and so they were good examples for all of us, and certainly for me.
What do you miss most about the Washington, D.C. that you grew up in?
The Washington, D.C. I grew up in, it's home. I mean, there's a lot of nostalgia when I think about, for instance, the Uline Arena, if you're familiar with it, or the Coliseum, or it was called the Ice House. And that was where, it's like the MCI or the Verizon Center is now. That's where the Ice Capade was. That's where the Bullets basketball team, which is now the Wizards, Bullets basketball team was there. That's where the Caps used to play. Everything happened there, and that was in my neighborhood.
Where was it?
Third and it was on Third, so 1100 block of 3rd Street between L and M, and it is now REI It's their show place, Recreation Equipment Inc.
Ivy City.
It's not far from it's called Noma. It's called north of Massachusetts Avenue. But that also, that's the neighborhood I grew up in. And all the places that used to be, all the houses all my friends lived in, they're all torn down for the most part. And they're either high-rise condos or brand new townhouses.
Was there a feeling that you would get when you would walk on your block?
Certainly previously walking on the block, it felt like home. I mean, it's where all the friends were. But now when I go back to that area, I see how the streets are paved. I see how commerce has come back. For instance, on 3rd and 8th Street, and there's a giant food store. It would have never been there back in the 60s and the 70s. And so
Where did you do your grocery shopping then?
Oh, we'd routinely go out to the Brentwood area, and there was a Safeway and A&P, and quite frankly, a jumbo out on Eastern Avenue. So my mom and dad drive out there to do shopping. To answer your question, yeah. So we'd have to go where the stores were.
So it was a bit of a challenge. So now you were in the military for 23 years. You retired in 2003?
Yes, after 26 years.
After 26 years?
Yes.
Pardon. What decisions did you make that said it's time to retire now, and how did you decide on the next step?
Oh, good. So someone always told me you'll always know when it's time to retire. You just feel it. And I really thought I was going to do 4 years and get out and go work as an architect in a firm somewhere down in San Antonio. But life happens. And moved around quicker than I thought I would, and I moved up quicker than I even imagined. And I looked up, and I was back in the D.C. area and the Pentagon. I pinned on major. I had more than half of a career there, so over 11 years. And I was on azimuth to 20 years. And I was pretty certain I'd retire then. But continued to get promoted, became a full colonel, and sent me over to be a base commander at Bowling Air Force Base. And I realized at that point, at some point, well, at this point I had more than 20 years in. When I finally decided to retire at 26, I decided, I thought then I would transition, go work for maybe an engineering firm, do more of what I'd been doing in the Air Force. But I got an opportunity to continue federal service, but as a senior executive for a intelligence agency. And so whenever I'm looking for an opportunity, I'm always looking to see if that organization share my values. Integrity, service, excellence. And so the agency I'm with does, and I've been with that agency now for 15 years in various capacities. So,
can you name it? Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure, it's the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. It's one of the it's one of the big 6 intel agencies. You're familiar with CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency. You're familiar with Defense Intelligence Agency. This is National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. What we do really is provide geospatial data so that folks will always know where they are, but more than that, we depict it in a way that we make sure that we don't just let you know where you are, but we're able to also characterize what you can expect from topography, from air, see, which is called bathymetry. But we're able to depict the area in a way that you can see it even in a 3D model. And so it's geospatial awareness is what we call it, but it's intelligence, which means
We better stop talking about it.
well, and I'm not telling you anything that's secret.
Right.
The intelligence is secret. The kind of intelligence that we provide is not a secret, though.
So your client, do you have private clients as well, or the U.S. government is your client?
Our client, our customer, by and large, are warfighters, but we also provide service to first responders, like in FEMA and the Homeland Security.
Of your background, do you most use, what have you brought with you into this position?
So the core competency that I've transitioned primarily from the military to anything that I do is leadership. And so since I've been there, I've run installation operations, run the security apparatus at some point. At some point I was the Deputy Chief Operating Officer for the agency. Most previously, the Director of Diversity Management and EEO, but currently the Inspector General for the agency. But in all of those capacities, and I've actually run collections for the agency, but in all those capacities, the one core competency I bring to each one of those jobs is leadership, being able to understand where we're going and move our agency forward.
As an African-American man, has that presented extra challenges or any that you're aware of in particular, or not so much?
I think it always does to some degree. For me, I would say not so much, because whenever I show up anywhere, I have a couple of rules for myself and others, and one is I try hard to give everyone a quality of access to opportunities and not discriminate against anyone, including myself. So when I show up to do a job, and I have a track record of getting it done. I don't worry very much about those that think differently about me. And what I've learned is, by and large, the leaders I've quite frankly had, the folks I've worked for doing my now 41 years of government service, have by and large been wise enough to select people that can get the job done. Do I think there is discrimination? Without a doubt there is. But those are micro decisions I've seen happen, and I try to do my part and make sure that I'm not contributing to that, and when I see that, I'm quick to call it out.
So in those 41 years of service, you started with parents who had a strong work ethic. I believe you told me your dad was a farmer, and that you rarely saw your parents sleeping or relaxing or chilling, if you will. And then you had a life of service in your church and in all of the jobs that you have taken on. Have all of these experiences, all of this exposure, do you believe that that's brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, as I mentioned, my dad migrated here from North Carolina. You're right, he did grow up on a farm. He came here as a government worker. My mom was a government worker. They both were for decades. But they were very disciplined. Work ethic was very important. We all had jobs around the house to do. Yes, it has a way of minting individuals, in my case, minting me to be disciplined, have a very strong work ethic. I would say the same about my siblings, without a doubt. And a certain confidence that you get from, I think I got a certain confidence from not worrying too much about what people thought about me, but realizing that there was always someone higher than even those that thought they were passing judgment on me. God's always been in charge of my life, and regardless of what other people think that they're doing or not. So that was instilled in me through my parents. And so to your last question, so I've never thought very much about how people judged me. I just did my best and knew that really you only had to worry about being judged by God himself.
Oh, what things are you most proud?
Things I'm most proud of, without a doubt, my kids. Yeah, they're both incredible. And some people ask me, says, you know, your kids, they did so well in school. How'd you do that? And this is what I always tell them. Well, we spend a lot of time on our knees, praying to God, but we learn not to just pray for the kids, but pray for their friends because they have a lot of influence. But then we learned you also got to pray for their friends' parents because that's who they're influenced by. But we give God all the credit, all the glory. So.
But you've been recognized for some pretty significant achievements. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I have. Most recently, it was a Presidential Rank Award. It's an award that's given to senior executives in the government, top 1%. I was told last year I was going to be nominated. That was an honor in itself, and I was good. But then in December, I was home on leave during the holidays, and I got a call from the director saying I was actually selected, so I was awarded the Presidential Rank Award under his current administration. But 8 years ago, 9 years ago, in 2009, during President Barack Obama's administration, I was honored with the award the first time, and so I'm somewhat proud of that because it is an achievement, but not nearly as proud as I am of my family.
I understand. For those of us who don't know, can you just talk a little bit more about that award, though? In other words, for what criteria are you selected? What puts you even in that conversation?
It's a meritorious rank award for leadership, and it's a body of work. Then the first time it was for a body of work of over 6 years. For this time, it's a body of work for over the last 9 years. As I mentioned, since I've been in this agency in a civilian capacity as a senior executive, I've had multiple opportunities, and I've actually had this is my fifth director. So it's not as if it was a single director that has recognized this. So at every opportunity I've been given, I've been blessed to be able to do a good job, a job that's considered, I guess, well enough by those that are certainly observing that I've been recognized for it. So I'm honored, I'm proud, I'm pleased, but I give a lot of credence to my team, but I give all the credit to God.
We're going to wrap up in one moment. We'll be right back.
Okay.
Before we go back to the last thing we were talking about, I think you have a story that you remembered about in the military. Can you share it with us? Sure.
The context is some of the situations that I may have had as a African American, as a black person, as a black officer in the Air Force, and I remember in many cases I would find myself in places where I was the only black officer, for that matter, only black person in an environment. I do remember when I was on a remote assignment to Republic of Korea in South Korea. I was on an assignment there for a year, remote from my family, and we had a very specialized project to bed down this weapon system called F-16, and they needed certain, there were certain logistical requirements in bedding down this, or preparing for this weapon system to come into country. And as a civil engineer officer, I was responsible for going around to these various sites to make sure that it was set up accordingly. And I do remember meeting one officer who was of the majority race, a white person, who asked me, I'm there with two other individuals that are junior to me, and he was in the middle of telling us something that was classified, and he stopped and said, looked at me, not the other individuals, and said, are you cleared? And I just shook my head and said, yes, I am. But in my head, I was thinking, you only asked me, you didn't ask anyone else. That was common fare. And it was those kinds of things that happen on occasions by certain individuals that would give you pause, would give me pause. But likewise in the military, because incidentally the military was, quite frankly, where race relationships was really, where it really matured, and the military set the standard for the rest of America for the most part. So I have equal stories about individuals that saw someone who was working harder, doing better than his peers, and elevated me to Officer of the Quarter, Officer of the Year, who also happened to be someone of a different race. So, but that happened routinely throughout my career in the military.
And you were able to deal with it and overcome it. Can we talk about some role models, or as you say, some of the exemplars in your life that helped, that helped shape your character and the person that you have become?
Yeah, and so first of all, without a doubt, we talk about my parents. My dad, I still remember him, even though he left us when I was a very young person. But my mom, I think she, without a doubt, is the person that I would give majority of the credit for who I am, because she was there during my entire development. But then there were individual stalwarts in history that I looked at that I thought to myself, Cardell, get a grip. If they could go through this, you certainly can. I think someone who was understated, underrated, woefully underrepresented was George Washington Carver. For goodness sakes, he was an inventor. He was a man back then, and during those times, to be so incredibly brilliant. And I think we know him to be that, but not nearly did he get the credit that I think he should have. Even though University of Iowa State University has an entire building and a statue for him for all the work he did out there, but I think just in American history he wasn't given the credit he should have. Then when I think about, we're talking about D.C. history, I think of Benjamin Banneker. Here's a guy who his grandmother was an English woman who came to America, had a couple of slaves. She liberated them both. She married one. And a white woman marries a this black man. They have a daughter who did basically the same thing. Had a slave, liberated him, married one. That was Benjamin Banneker's mom. He grows up pretty much educated by Quakers, but the point really is he's a black guy. Born in 1731, I think. He grows up. He's a surveyor. He's an engineer. He's an inventor. He's an astronomer. He works with Pierre Charles L'Enfant to lay out Washington, D.C. Get this. This isn't like 1789. Just think about that. 1789, Pierre Charles L'Enfant decides he has some issue. He walks off the job, takes his plans with him, and leaves. Basically leaves the American statesman high and dry. But Benjamin Banneker worked with Pierre Charles L'Enfant, memorized all this stuff. In 2 days, he recreates the plan. So Benjamin Banneker lays out all of Washington, D.C. in 1790. And when you think about it, he's a black man in 1790. And I just think that the history books are void of that kind of extraordinary efforts, those kinds of extraordinary efforts and abilities of black people that incidentally have been resident in black people our entire lives.
Did you know about Benjamin Banneker when you made your decision about architecture?
I mean, I knew he was given credit for laying out Washington, D.C. I didn't really understand all of it. I mean, there's a school named after him on Georgia Avenue. Banneker was a junior high school. I think it's much more than that now. But at any rate, yeah, I was somewhat aware of him. Was he an influence? I would say not so much. But as I've grown up and as I've read more about D.C. history and just gotten more involved and more interested in black history in general, and then you read about stalwarts like him and Charles Drew and a number of others, it just makes one realize just how incredible we are. President Barack Obama, and here's one, Oprah Winfrey, for goodness sakes, black woman, she's a billionaire.
So as you think now about next chapter, have you already started composing a next chapter for yourself?
And so I'm always thinking about what's next and after next. And so I have. And, I'm in the age of my life where I'm really considering retiring, but I don't want to retire from anything. I want to retire to something. And so one of those things is I certainly want to fully stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And what I really mean by that is I really want to be a launching pad for those that come after me. But I don't want them to start from ground zero. As I stand on someone else's shoulder, I want to allow myself, make myself available for them to stand on mine. And, charity starts at home. And so I think about my 4 grandkids. The oldest 2 are 4, be 5 this year, school agers. And I got a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. But then there's a whole...
Do they live in the D.C. area?
They live in North Virginia, not far from me. I see them routinely, at least once a week. That's the rule. And they can come over my house, or I'll go over there. But the point is, I'm as serious about them as my parents were about me, as my grandparents were about their children. I told my son I knew he was going to be a great dad because he comes from a long line. I told my daughter the same about being a mom. So to answer your question, I see myself in the next chapter as lifting the youth up, those that belong to me and those that certainly can benefit from what I have to offer. Because there's a lot of folks around Asbury, for instance. As I mentioned, my dad passed when I was 4. But when I think of people like Floyd Robinson, Aishan Baker, and Richard Nero, John Sanford, and Leslie Sanders, and some others, these were all fathers of the church, but who also really adds real meaning to it takes a village. And so I want to be a part of that village for someone who comes behind me.
What do you think is the next chapter for Asbury?
Well, that's a good question. I will tell you whatever it is, and I'll try to answer the question, but whatever it is, we'll surmount it. And you think about this, Asbury is almost as old as Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has only been here since 1790. Asbury's been here since 1836. So we're coming up on 200 years, and we've gone through a lot. I mean, just Edifice alone is, we're on the 3rd one. I expect it will still be there, but the point is, times have changed. They've been changing. They didn't just start. What's in the next chapter? I think as long as we continue to be a place where people can worship, as long as we can be a place where we can serve, as long as we recognize our community and really provide service to that community, and as long as we're a faithful church. As long as we're a faithful church.
What does a faithful church feel like for you?
Putting God first, which means whatever we do, because, Asbury, as we talk about it, I think as we think about it, we think about that gray structure on the corner of 11th and K Street. But the church is in each one of us. And I remember a young minister when we were out in Kansas, Tyrone Gordon, saying, sometimes you are the only, people will only see Christ when they see you. Sometimes you will be the only Bible anyone will ever read. So you have to present yourself as such. And they need to know that there's a grace of God in all of us, but it has to be exemplified in each one of us, which means the way I present myself. And then when I tell someone that I'm an Asburian or that invite them to Asbury, they may be inclined to come because they see something that would draw them to that edifice. But each one of us is the church, and we can't be confused about that. And so I think when I say faithful, I think we have to put God first, and we have to have faith that if we're doing His will, Asbury will not just survive, but thrive.
Thank you. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to share?
I think to sign off, I would say this. Growing up in D.C. has been a blessing. I would say growing up and having Asbury such an integral part of my life has just increased that blessing. And I would love to see Asbury continue to be a faithful church and always present itself as such, so that people will know that this is a place where you can come and know Christ.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interview. Thank you for your service. And thank you for being the role model that you are for those of us who see you at Asbury and wherever you are in your life.
Well, thanks. I'm honored to have sit for this interview, and thanks for the kind words.